This is absolutely the most despairing way to die. On February the 25th, 2022, 5 divers were commissioned by an oil company to carry out maintenance work on an underwater oil pipeline. But due to the large difference in internal and external air pressure, the moment the divers unscrewed a bolt, the narrow pipeline acted like a black hole, sucking in all the surrounding air, seawater, and the 5 divers with their tanks. They were pushed through the pipeline by the water for over a minute, swallowing who knows how much seawater before they finally came to a stop. Although it was pitch black around them and completely silent, the fortunate thing was that they were in a relatively high part of the pipeline, so it wasn't fully flooded, and there was some oxygen for them to breathe. As they gradually regained consciousness, they started calling out for each other. 2 of them had broken bones, but most were still relatively clear-headed. At that moment, the 5 were completely consumed by fear and despair. They knew clearly that no one was coming to rescue them, and everything was up to them. Now, however, in this pitch-dark pipeline filled with a mix of oil and water, getting out alive seemed harder than reaching the sky. There was some leftover oxygen, but it wouldn't last long, and the seawater could flood the pipe at any time. Rather than waiting to die, they decided to take a chance. Gritting their teeth, they crawled forward slowly like centipedes. After struggling for about an hour, Chris, who was in the front, noticed that the water level seemed to be rising. If they moved further, they'd have to go underwater, but their oxygen tanks were already lost. No one knew how long the distance was, and 2 people were injured. If any teammate fell behind, they'd all be doomed, with no other option. Chris decided to go ahead alone to scout the way. If he could make it out, he promised to find help. If he didn't come back, it meant he didn't make it. The other 4 agreed that this was the safest approach, so Chris pressed on alone. After crawling for about 20 minutes, the pipe was nearly completely flooded. Holding his breath, Chris dove underwater, determined to risk everything. About 30 seconds later, his hand suddenly touched something. Feeling it carefully, he realized it was an oxygen tank, filled with hope. He pushed forward with more determination, but after swimming for over half an hour, he still hadn't reached the end of the pipeline, and his oxygen was running out. Perhaps fate was still on his side. His hand touched another tank. Without thinking, he shoved the tube into his mouth, enduring the strong smell of oil as he pressed on. Another 20 minutes passed when Chris' heart skipped a beat. He had finally reached a bend in the pipeline. Nervously but excitedly, he swam upwards. His life depended on this moment. Luckily, Chris emerged to the surface and began shouting desperately for help. More than 2 hours had passed since the 5 were sucked into the pipeline, and his colleagues on the ship, realizing something was wrong, had been searching for them. At that moment, they heard his cries and pulled him up with a chain. Weak and exhausted, Chris explained the situation inside the pipe and urged the oil company to send rescue teams immediately. Before losing consciousness, when Chris woke up, he found himself in a hospital bed. But when he asked about the rescue progress, he received an infuriating answer. The company had indeed sent people to check the situation underwater, and when they knocked on the pipe, someone inside responded. But because the pipeline was too narrow, they couldn't rescue anyone without dismantling the entire pipeline, which would harm the company's interests. So, the high-ups decided to abandon the rescue plan. 5 days later, the Pallier Oil Company announced that the bodies of the 4 were intact, but all had perished. When the coroner performed the autopsies, they found that after Chris made it out, the others had held on through sheer willpower for a long time, dying only on the 4th day. No one can imagine the pain and despair they went through before they died, and even Chris could not forgive himself. After being discharged from the hospital, Chris, overwhelmed with guilt, sued the Pallier Oil Company, hoping they would face legal consequences.